218 BC. Hannibal's army stood at the foot of the Alps, with elephants that had never seen snow and men who had never seen mountains. There was no map, no scout had gone ahead and returned with good news. The Carthaginian officers pressed him to winter in Gaul, to wait for spring, to let the weather decide instead of the man. Hannibal crossed anyway. Men died on the ice. Pack animals went over the edge in the dark. And when his army came down the other side into Italy, what waited for Rome wasn't a battered force that had gotten lucky. It was an army that had already survived the worst thing that could happen to it, led by a man who had walked them through it and brought most of them out the other side. Cannae followed. Rome lost more men in a single afternoon than in almost any battle in its history. And the legions that broke that day weren't broken by tactics alone. They were broken by the fact that Hannibal's men no longer feared anything Rome could do to them, because they had already feared the mountain, and the mountain hadn't killed them. 1900 years later, Napoleon stood at the same range with the same problem. His marshals told him the passes were unusable until the snow cleared. He moved 40,000 men through the Great St. Bernard Pass in May anyway. Cannons disassembled and dragged on sledges, soldiers pulling artillery upgrades that mules refused to climb. He came down into the Po Valley, behind the Austrian army, who believed, correctly, by every rule of military logic, that no one moves an army through that pass in that season. Marengo followed. And what followed Marengo wasn't just a battlefield win. It was the moment the rest of Europe understood that this man did not play by the rules that govern hesitation. Here is the actual mechanism underneath both stories. Stripped of the romance and harmony as a system, left alone, under pressure, with no clear outcome. In sight, every system drifts toward disorder, morale erodes. Rumor spreads faster than information. Doubt compounds. This is entropy, not as metaphor, but as the literal tendency of any complex structure to decay into noise unless something actively fights to hold its shape. Most commanders manage entropy by minimizing exposure to it. They wait for better information. They wait for spring. Waiting feels like prudence, and most of the time it is. But waiting also has a cost. That doesn't show up on a ledger. Every day spent waiting is a day the system bleeds order on its own, with nobody steering the bleed. What Hannibal and Napoleon did was different in kind, not degree. They walked directly into the highest entropy environment available, voluntarily, without certainty of outcome. And they did it in front of everyone whose loyalty they needed. That second part matters more than the crossing itself. An army doesn't follow a man because he is brave in private. It follows him because it watched him take the system into chaos and bring it out the other side, still recognizable as an army. The corrosion was visible. The frostbite was visible. The lost elephants were visible. And the man at the front of it didn't flinch in a way anyone could see, even if he was corroding on the inside the entire time. That visibility converts directly into the kind of loyalty that doesn't require explanation, the kind that doesn't ask. Why are we doing this anymore? Because the question already got answered on a mountain in front of witnesses. This is the part almost nobody studying power actually internalizes. The corrosion is real. Facing entropy at that scale does damage. Doubt erodes a man's certainty, the same way it erodes an army's morale. Because the commander is also a system, and systems decay under uncertainty regardless of rank. The difference between the men history remembers and the men it forgets is not that the remembered ones felt no corrosion. It's that they had built something inside themselves capable of absorbing that corrosion without the whole structure collapsing. That capacity is not a personality trait you're born with. It's closer to infrastructure. It has to be built deliberately. The same way an army builds supply lines before a campaign rather than during one. So here is the structural version of this. The part that's actually usable rather than just inspiring. First, identify where your current order is rented rather than owned. Most positions of authority look stable because routine is propping them up. Not because the people underneath have actually metabolized why they follow. That kind of order evaporates the moment a real disruption hits, because nobody has ever watched the leader operate without the routine. The fix is not waiting for a crisis to reveal this. The fix is finding small, controlled, high-entropy situations and walking into them on purpose. A founder who has never made a decision with incomplete information in front of his team is operating on rented authority. The first real crisis will either mint his command or expose it, and there's no controlling which. Second, build the recovery system before you need it, not after. Napoleon could move through St. Bernard Pass and recover quickly because the logistics behind him. Supply chains, the secondary commanders, the administrative machine he'd built in Paris, were absorbing entropy on every other front while he spent his personal reserve on the crossing. Power that survives repeated exposure to chaos is rarely the result of one man having infinite personal resilience. It's the result of a system designed so that only one variable is under maximum stress at a time. Anyone facing entropy without that kind of structural backup is not being brave. They're spinning down a finite account with no deposits coming in. Third, decisiveness under incomplete information has to be trained the way a muscle is trained. In small, repeated doses, because the instinct to wait for more data is the instinct that creates the rented authority in the first place. Every time a decision gets delayed until the information is complete, the muscle for acting without complete information atrophies a little more. The skill that actually matters. In command, the one that both Hannibal and Napoleon possessed in a way their contemporaries didn't, was the ability to act on 60% certainty and absorb whatever the other 40% turned out to cost. That is trainable in low-stakes environments, specifically so it's available in high-stakes ones. Fourth, the crossing has to be witnessed, or it doesn't convert into loyalty. This is the leverage point that gets missed constantly, because it looks like vanity from the outside. A man who suffers privately and succeeds privately gains nothing in terms of the system around him, because the system never saw the corrosion or the survival of it. The crossing only pays its dividend in loyalty if the people whose trust you need were close enough to watch you not break. This doesn't mean theater. It means proximity. Leaders who insulate themselves from the people they lead during the actual hard part of a campaign, who manage the crisis from a comfortable remove, never get the crushing version of the victory afterward. They get a functional outcome and nothing more, because nobody watched them survive anything. Fifth, and this is the part that separates the existential reading of this from the trivial one. None of this is about being impressive in the way a disciplined morning routine is impressive, or the way hitting a deadline under pressure is impressive. Those are small, recoverable stakes. What Hannibal and Napoleon were doing at the base of those mountains was staking their actual continuity, the literal survival of the thing they had built their identity around, against an outcome they could not predict. The corrosion they absorbed wasn't stress in the everyday sense. It was closer to a controlled confrontation with their own potential erasure, the possibility that the army, the campaign, the entire shape of who they were about to become, simply didn't make it to the other side of the mountain. Facing that and still functioning, still making clear decisions, still projecting enough certainty that thousands of frightened men kept walking behind you into snow, is not a productivity hack. It's a different category of act entirely. This is why the victory on the other side was never just tactical. Cannae and Marengo were devastating because the men fighting them had already passed through something that should have devastated them first, and didn't. The enemy was fighting soldiers. The soldiers were fighting nothing, because they had already faced the thing that should have broken them, and walked out the other side still intact. That is the actual content of power at this scale, not the absence of entropy. The proof, witnessed by everyone who needed to see it, that entropy met you directly, and you were still standing when it was over. The mountain doesn't care who you are. It corrodes everyone the same amount. The only variable in the entire equation is what's left of you when you reach the other side, and whether the people who watched you cross decide, from that point forward, that they would follow you into anything.